Hey Warriors, this is a U.S. history lesson found on page 33 in your notebooks, and it is post-Civil War industrialization, spanning the time frame from 1870 to 1916. And the first question on your page is, what is industrialization? And so let's try to kind of describe this in as simple a way as we can. It is the country kind of getting down to the business of growing economically. It becomes all about making stuff and selling stuff, okay? Making things and then making money off of it. Producing, sometimes mass producing products that they can sell to the American people, and then even making more than that and selling what's left over to other markets around the world. So industrialization refers to a time in America's history when they really want to get down to business and become an economic power in the world. Okay, when we talked about one of the reasons why during Reconstruction, for instance, that Congress and the American people kind of lost interest in the Freedmen's Bureau and lost interest in the goals of Reconstruction, were that the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed and the country was anxious to create new communities, new business opportunities, all the way out to the West Coast. And this is what the country now begins to get very busy doing. The period of industrialization is the country getting down to business, making stuff and making money. The next portion on your worksheet says, what are the characteristics of industrial growth after the Civil War? And there are three characteristics that I want you to write down. Number one is that machines will begin to replace hand labor in a very widespread way. All right, machines replace hand labor or work that had previously done by hand. And this obviously puts some people out of work. It may have created jobs for some other people. But when you have work that was previously done by hand that required a lot of maybe skill and a lot of time, a lot of hours of work, and then a machine is created that is able to do that work instead of a human being. A machine doesn't have to have a lunch break or a bathroom break or a smoke break. A machine doesn't even need to sleep at night. And so the machine is going to be far more productive. It's going to produce far more of whatever that product is than a person is going to be able to do. And so during this time, especially when the country is concentrating on producing a lot of stuff so they can sell it, machines begin to replace hand labor in an awful lot of the business landscape. The second thing that happens is there's a lot of innovation and invention during this time. In 1885, the gas-powered engine, the gas-powered automobile was invented. During this time, the typewriter was invented. People no longer had to write letters by hand, but they could write on a machine that would be able to produce letters that looked the same every time, were always readable, always well organized, always well spaced. And these seem like things to us that we take for granted now. But imagine when they first were invented and became part of American culture, what a significant change they made. The phonograph, which was like an early version of a record player, was invented during this time. And so the country really begins to change. The business landscape begins to change because there's lots and lots and lots of new inventions being made. Some of that invention and innovation referred to the way that different materials, different metal alloys, steel, for instance, were able to be produced. And this allowed the country, when they were building buildings and building factories and even rebuilding railroads, they were able to use steel, which was lighter and more easily shaped and stronger than iron, which they had previously used. This really revolutionized the country and the business and industrial side of America's purpose, because all of a sudden you could build very, very tall buildings that were built on steel frames. Prior to that, buildings were built on wood frames. And if you get a whole lot higher than 2 or 3 stories in a wood frame building, when the wind blows hard, it starts to move a little bit and people on the top floor get uncomfortable. So steel enabled us to build lots of new and bigger, better kinds of buildings and factories and facilities. So all of this is going on during this time. The third characteristic of industrial growth was that investors began to play a role in business. And this becomes very important. Say you had a business and you had some people working for you and you were producing tables and chairs. And all of a sudden you had kind of all the business that you could take. If you could make more tables and chairs, you could sell them, but you were in a small building and you only had 10 or 12 people working for you. And what you really need is somebody to give you some money so you can buy a bigger building and hire some more employees. Well, along comes someone who wants to invest in your company, give you the money you need to move into a bigger building and hire more people and buy more machinery. And they're an investor. They're investing money in your business. And they're happy to do that as long as you will take part of the profit that you make from your business and give it back to them every year. Okay? And they don't want just the money that they gave you back. They want more than that because they were nice enough to help you financially. And so what this does to kind of change the country during this time of industrialization is that the owner of the company in a capitalist system, the owner of the company, say it's you, wants to keep as much profit for themselves as they can. Sometimes just for themselves, sometimes to reinvest in the business and the machinery. And now they have to pay some money to an investor also, who never even enters the building, but who that owner who you owe money to, okay? And it creates less and less money left over to pay the workers. And so workers' conditions in many cases got worse and worse and worse. And a lot of that money was going to ownership and it was going to investors. And it kind of changed the workplace, especially for working class people. The next thing on your page is let's contrast or let's show the difference between developments in the North and the South at this time. And we can include the western part of the country with the South. In the North, we know that when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, that was kind of moving across the top half of the country in terms of North and South. We know that the southern states were interested in the government helping them to build a southern version of the Transcontinental Railroad, which would have helped them in their business interests. But that didn't happen. So the Transcontinental Railroad, located in the northern half of the country, really helps the northern states and the northern parts of the country as you move west to develop economically and to develop with new businesses and new communities. And so a lot of the advancement, a lot of the investment in business, a lot of the successful businesses happen to be happening in that top half of the country at this time. In the South, you remember the South was mostly an agrarian economy before this, farming economy. And so there were lots of people still farming. There were very poor farmers who may have owned their land, but they were struggling to produce crops and to feed their families and maybe find a way to sell a little bit else, a little bit of that on the side to someone else. Remember, the infrastructure or the roads, railroads, things like that in the South were still torn up after the Civil War. And so you had these small, very poor farmers, both black people and white people. Then you had these huge farms where the land was probably better for growing crops, but with the end of slavery, the labor force wasn't necessarily there. So a lot of the owners of these large pieces of property ended up contracting with farmers, individual farmers, as tenant farmers or sharecroppers, and they would essentially rent them a piece of their land, and they would plant and grow on that land whatever they could plant and grow. They would keep a little bit for their family, and they would give the rest to the landowner. Okay, so this was an awful lot of what business was in the South. So they were kind of lagging behind a little bit in some of these advancements, some of the progress that the northern portion of the country was experiencing during the Industrial Revolution. On the back side of the page, it says areas of growth in American society. And so let's look at these real quickly. Number one, population, especially in the cities. There were huge numbers of immigrants coming to the country between 1870 and 1916. The overall population grew from 40 million people to 100 million people. During that time, 25 million immigrants entered the country. People moved here from other countries. Okay. By the 1920s, more than half of the population was living in cities as opposed to rural areas or countryside areas, and it never changed from the 20s. From that point on, always we've had more people in the cities than in the country. The second one, poor and working class people who were de-skilled. Their jobs often were taken away from them because a machine replaced them. Those workers were mostly employed in factories, mines, and mills. They often worked probably an average of 60 hours a week. They made about 20 cents an hour. And you say, well, yeah, that was 100 years ago. But 20 cents an hour in today's money would have been about $5.50 an hour. So still way below our minimum wage. The third area of growth was very wealthy people. There were in 1850, 20 millionaires in the United States. And by 1900, there were more than 3,000. Sometimes this period of history is referred to as the Gilded Age, gilding referring to a coating of gold. Okay, the number of millionaires went up exponentially. Also, economic depressions. The economy would go through periods of booms and busts. Booms when the economy was good, and busts when it would take a dive. And it was sort of this roller coaster ride, the economy. And so you had these depressions, the lower part, when the economy would start to fall apart a little bit. In 1873, 1884, 1893, 1907, it seemed that every 10 to 14 years, the economy was taking a dive again. It would rebuild itself and it would go back down. So the economy was very unstable. And the fifth area of growth was political reform. And there was in this country, especially from 1890 to 1915 or so, a movement called the Progressive Movement. There was even a progressive party that ran a political candidate in 1904, or it might have been 1908, I can't remember. But what the country saw, especially because of these up and down economic times, is that they needed to create new laws to make a fairer field of play for working class people. And there was some progress made, significant progress made for working class people during that progressive era. Some reforms politically were made, and those political reforms kind of trickled down to the working class people. So that's it for this lesson. And I'm going to put a little extra lesson in here about capitalism, communism, and socialism. So look for that extra video also. I'll see you in the next video.